So Victoria, welcome to Upstream Livestream in the Superunion studio.
Thanks very much for having me.
Well, pleasure to have you here. Now, Shout, the organisation that you run, is concerned with mental health and well-being. Tell us a little bit more to start about the work that you do.
So Shout is it's the UK's first 24/7 text-based crisis service for anyone. So people can text in to us, they can text in free and off bill, anytime, 24/7, and have a conversation about how they're feeling. And we hope to get people from a point of feeling quite overwhelmed or anxious or feeling as though they can't cope to a point of feeling much calmer and with a sort of plan for where they could get their next bit of help from. And for us, it's what's really important is that people feel that there's someone there for them, that it's non-judgmental, that it's you can contact us about anything. So people contact us about relationships or bullying at school, relationships at school, situations at home that might be worrying, everything from sort of domestic violence to people that are concerned about a loved one as well. So sometimes we get people who contact us about a friend.
And text-based, that's interesting. So people are only communicating by text, no voice, no other channels?
No other channels.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing. I think we feel that what's really powerful about text is that it's silent. So people can be anywhere. So we have kids texting us from school. It might be school lunchtime and they're having a hard time. And actually no one thinks it's unusual, if you're just texting on a phone. So you don't have to worry about being overheard, you don't have to try and find a quiet place. And particularly because a lot of people text us, so our busiest times is at night. Right. And that is often, we all know that, things always feel 10 times worse in the middle of the night. So you can text us without waking up anyone else in your house and just, get that support in the moment.
Interesting. So it's a sort of pattern, it's a way of behaving really. I suppose it's different and it taps into a different form of communication that way. I mean, there are a lot of organisations in the world and in the UK concerned with mental health and well-being. How do you fit within that kind of ecosystem of others, and what makes Shout different to the many other sort of opportunities people can take for support or help?
Yeah, so I suppose so partly it's the technology and the texting. And sort of, if you like, the sort of behind the scenes bit. So Shout is a bit different because all of our volunteers and all of our clinical team are remote. Mm-hmm. So everybody's at home on a laptop. So we have over 1,000 volunteers now who can log on from home. They can volunteer at any time, sign up to volunteer a bit like you'd sign up to do a gym class. Mm. And then they're supervised in real time by one of our clinical team. So you get all that support, you get that sort of in the moment, gosh, someone's just said this and I'm not quite sure how to respond, am I doing okay? So you get that very sort of wraparound feeling of support from our clinical team, but from home. Mm. So it enables all sorts of people that perhaps couldn't find the time or wouldn't be able to volunteer to be able to do that at home. I think the other thing that's different about us, which we're really proud of, is that we are providing the service as Shout, sort of as a general service for the public, but we are also the crisis messenger for a number of charities. So we are working with, I think at the moment, about 16 different charities, providing them with a white labelled, effectively, crisis messenger service, so that they don't need to build their own platform to do this and recruit their own volunteers and go to all the expense of doing that. Right. And we'll continue to do that for charities across the UK.
So it's interesting, so it's a technology solution effectively, although text in itself feels like an old technology, right? But it is a technology. So it's a technology solution to obviously a real and potentially growing issue in society. Yeah. Technology itself, and in particular, let's say social media technologies, are also not immune from criticism around the contribution they may make to issues in that respect. I mean, what's your view on technology generally and the role that it's playing in not just a solution but also potentially a problem?
Yeah, so I think there's no question that being connected all the time isn't probably very good for us, and it's particularly probably not very good for kids. I've got 2 teenage kids myself, and I am concerned that that as parents, particularly my generation of parents, I think we're probably the worst because we didn't grow up with any social media. So I'm not sure that we've probably done a very good job of understanding the impact that it might have on our kids, and also teaching them how to use it. And also there's all the stuff around technology, which we know, which is it is sort of deliberately addictive. And it, right. You know, that's how it works. So I think there's a lot of work we need to do to make sure that the technology doesn't run us and we run it. And I think we do need to think about that a lot. And I hope that social media companies are going to start thinking about the responsibilities as well as the opportunities. But on the flip side, I suppose, you know, we have a huge challenge in this country, globally as well, but certainly in this country in terms of reaching the numbers of young people, particularly who are in need of help and support. You know, we have 1.25 million young people in the UK in need of some kind of help and support, and we employ 7,000 professionals to help them. So we are going to need to find a way of getting more support to people. And I think digital has a role to play in that. I think technology can do a lot of good. With our service, I think particularly what I like about it is it's there. It's on, you know, it's on the phone. Or it's, you know, it is online. It is where people sort of need it to be, and it's instant. So, you know, I think we do have to change our relationship with technology. And we have to think particularly about how we educate ourselves to use it better and to think about that. But I also think it has exceptional potential.
Right. That's an interesting point of view that I hadn't really considered before, that you've got a generation of parents, really, I suppose, and mentors growing up who don't have the experience of how to manage that situation. Or you don't have the sort of retrospective view on what would I do differently if I had my time again, I guess, which I suppose is so much of what wisdom really is, right? And I suppose in some ways that's hope for the future, that you'll have generations who will have grown up understanding both the opportunities and the pitfalls in technology, and therefore maybe better guides to their own children or to generations.
And I think we learn more and more about all of these things. I mean, I think you know, when my kids were little, you know, and you know, sometimes you'd, I don't know, put them in front of Thomas the Tank Engine or Postman Pat or whatever it was, and you know, that was normal. You know, you know, kids would watch TV and all that sort of stuff, and I'm not sure that we really understood how different it was to move from, you know, watching a TV to sitting there with a tablet or a phone and all the other things that you could do with it. But I mean, these products are so brilliantly intuitive. You see small children, you know, swiping, moving, you know, it is how they're going to grow up. So we just have to work out how to make that a sort of positive experience rather than a negative one. Yeah,
it's really interesting. I mean, I don't think anyone ever started out designing products with the view that they would be bad for people, but sometimes consequences are unintended, and it's interesting how these things will evolve. I mean, looking at mental health generally as a I'm going to use the word issue, I'm not sure it's necessarily the right word, but mental health in society, do you think that we have is there a growing crisis? I mean, are we seeing more and more issues of mental health, or are we just becoming more aware of issues that are perhaps always there but undiscovered? What's the sort of state of play, if you like?
So I think it's really hard to know whether people are more willing to come forward, and therefore we are seeing more. If that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more, the fact is we are seeing more, and I think there is a lot of evidence to show that certainly the mental health of young people is declining, particularly girls. Adolescent girls, but the numbers are increasing all the time. So, you know, over the last 5 years, 50% more young people have arrived at A&E in some kind of mental health crisis. And it's a terrible place to be if you're in some kind of mental health crisis. We don't want, you know, children and young people pitching up to A&E because, you know, they've reached a sort of crisis point in their mental health. So I think it is certainly becoming more of a crisis. I think the solution to that is really about better awareness and support in the early stages. So without trying to be controversial here, I think schools have an incredibly important role to play, and I think if I was a head teacher, I would be concerned about how little support I had around me, or how little resource I had around me to help support the mental health of the young people in my school. And I think where schools have got some kind of mental health expertise or support in there, that, you know, the children tend to do better. Because actually the crucial thing is that we grow up knowing that reaching out for help is a good thing. It's the not reaching out for help which I think is where things go really wrong. So there's an interesting piece of research recently about what are called adverse childhood events. So, you know, things that could be very difficult and are known to be difficult for children and young people growing up. And those events are not necessarily traumatic. In other words, they don't necessarily create any sort of mental health problem, unless the brain perceives itself to be alone. So it is the sense of that fear of being alone that causes the trauma, rather than the event itself.
Sort of intellectual isolation. You have to cope with it, deal with it by yourself. You're the only person going through that. Right. Exactly.
So actually, you know, there is a big piece here about making sure that we, you know, children and young people grow up, and, you know, and adults as well, we all need to do it, but particularly children and young people grow up feeling that reaching out for help is a really good thing, and that, you know, good kind of what we would call help-seeking behaviours are really positive. So, you know, people might text us at Shout, for example, and sort of say, you know, I'm texting because, you know, Cindy was mean to me in the playground. Brilliant. You know, fantastic. You know, we don't want people to wait until they are feeling completely overwhelmed and unable to cope before they contact us. And hopefully, you know, they have a really good experience and someone says, wow, you know, well done you for reaching out for help. And they feel really good about that experience. And that sort of reinforces that kind of behaviour. So I think, I mean, we're not the only people, by all means. We would much rather that people were talking to a teacher or a friend or you know, a mentor of some kind, but that is what's crucial, that we encourage young people and create a norm around reaching out for help, and that is the best, smartest, bravest thing you can do.
Best way to solve a crisis is to head the crisis off before it becomes one.
And share it.
Yeah. And I mean, much has been talked about sort of destigmatizing mental health issues as a you know, it's almost a sort of polarized view, right? That you're either mentally healthy or mentally unhealthy. And I mean, it always strikes me that there's surely a massive continuum in between, right? And that but the stigmas are breaking down to an extent. But where do you think we are on that? Have we destigmatized mental health issues, or how far have we still got to go?
So I think we've done a good job to some, you know, in beginning to talk about the taboos around mental health. I think we have a long way to go, not least because I think there is a very ancient part of our brain that really believes that if you have these sorts of problems, that you are, you know, as you would have been, you know, years ago, kind of thrown out the village. I mean, it you know, that is what happened to people for generations and generations, that you were, you know, sort of permanently excluded, and it is that worry that you will be excluded, and that I think that's very deeply ingrained in us, and so it's going to take a long time before, you know, we don't believe that that's what's going to happen to us if we talk about our mental health. And we know that you know, women, for example, who might be struggling with some postnatal depression, biggest reason not to reach out for help and support is a fear that someone's going to take their baby away. So I think there is quite a punitive sense around mental health that we need to sort of try and tackle. And I think the other thing is we need to start thinking about the language we use around mental health. Most of the mental health language we use is effectively the language of failure. So we talk about, you know, can't cope, can't manage. You know, it's all very, very negative. So I think, you know, we need to start talking positively about all the good ways in which we can communicate that we're not feeling great, and what a good thing that is.
Right. Because I mean, we're a creative business, and one of the great things about a creative business is the kind of neurological diversity I think that we experience within our own people. And one of our great strengths is our ability to combine different ways of thinking, different types of problem solving. And I think very often creativity for us is that moment where somebody who thinks one way and somebody else who thinks another way come together and create a problem that couldn't create a solution to a problem in a way that they could never have achieved individually. So we embrace some form of neurodiversity here. But do you think that we need a wider definition of what constitutes normal in society? I mean, we are a bit sort of linear, aren't we? That you think in a certain way, normal is a certain set of behaviours, and it's a little outmoded, isn't it, as an idea?
Totally, and I think it's true of mental health. I think it's true of we're much further down the road, for example, in terms of embracing diversity in gender and sexuality and all those sorts of things than we are with mental health. But here we are, 50th anniversary of Stonewall and Pride, and we're still seeing lots of discrimination and sort of hate speech and all those sorts of things. So we definitely need that. And I think there is something very absolutely right in what you said about people that are very different coming together to find a solution. I think generally across so many of our challenges, whether it's mental health or Brexit or any of the other things that we're challenging with, that it is always, the answer is always a jigsaw. The answer is always, slotting together some sort of weirdly shaped pieces to create a whole. And I think, I do think, certainly in the field that I work in, we're too many silos. We have too much, this is public sector, this is voluntary sector, this is private sector. Actually, we all need to work together, whether that's on the environment or any of the big challenges we have at the moment. Right. And we won't do it by just one section of us working in a siloed way. Yeah.
And for businesses and brands, I mean, what do you feel about the contribution generally that you see businesses and brands making to those sorts of issues, and what more would you like to see in the future? What kind of ways can businesses and brands do more to engage and to help and be part of that solution?
So I definitely think businesses and brands, particularly brands that young people want to feel part of and belong to, can do a lot around messaging, language, positivity, all those sorts of things, which I think it has much more value than people place on it. I mean, personally, I am less interested in how much money business can deliver, but much more interested in message, really, and in helping to kind of break down this thing. So I think from our perspective with Shout, for example, we would like people to be promoting it as a service that's available for customers, for staff, for the kind of wider families of people that work. So I'm much more interested in people knowing that we're out there and exist than I am in whether or not I'm going to get a check for sticking my brand next to yours. And I think it's very interesting for us. We have a number of businesses who've really taken up the volunteering part of our offer, so have really promoted the volunteering to their staff. And I think that's been a fantastic experience, because actually from the business's point of view, they now have, in certainly some cases, 25, 30 people in the business that have a set of skills that they didn't have before, which is great. A lot of them volunteer together, so they might volunteer from sort of 6 till 8 at night, on business premises, and then go out and have a meal or a drink together afterwards, which is great. So I think we've found a really positive conversation to be had around volunteering, skills, knowledge, understanding, and that's been great.
Well, it's been engaging for a workforce as well. I mean, not only are people learning more skills, which I'm sure they could apply into a working environment as well. But I'm sure that sense of purpose would be meaningful. A lot of companies talking about defining purpose in very broad, sort of socially responsible terms, which is great. But yeah, I think the real question is always how do you activate and what do people actually do that contributes to that? And so I think that's interesting. It strikes me as well that we're living in an age of activism in some ways, a sort of emergent age of activism. I look at Extinction Rebellion, which is probably the single most important political movement of 2019, and certainly the most effective if you talk about change. And I think it's interesting you talk about the need for communication more than sort of financial support and so forth. And it strikes me that is a feature of our society today, that we need people to actually stand up and do things, right? Not just sort of talk about things or support things. I mean, you've been within the charity and non-profit sector for a long time in a number of different organisations and some very senior roles. What are the big changes that you've seen over time in that sector, and what are the biggest challenges that the charity sector as a whole faces as you look forward into the next 5 years or so?
Interesting. So I guess the biggest change has probably been around a greater interest and focus on impact, really. Mm-hmm. So, actually, how do we as the voluntary sector become much better at measuring what we do, not just outputs, but much more sort of outcomes focused. And I think that's been probably the biggest single change in the charity sector in my time, has been much more focus on impact evaluation. What is the value of what I'm achieving here, and I think that's been quite a struggle for a lot of people. Right. And I guess if I'm being really honest, I think most people sort of there was a sense within the voluntary sector that well, I'm doing a really good thing, so don't ask me to justify it. Right.
Well, hard to measure, right? As well, is it hard to measure or?
Sometimes it's hard to measure, but
or
I think
just easy not to measure.
Yeah, I think it depends. It depends on what it is that your organisation does. So one of the challenges for us, for example, with the text service. So I can easily tell you, because it's a tech-based service, I can tell you how many people text in. I can tell you how long the conversation lasts. I can tell you what the conversations are about, what age. I can tell you all sorts of things. What I really need to be able to tell you, and what you probably really want to know, is how effective are we at doing what we say we do. Right. So we say we take people from a moment of crisis to calm. How can I evidence that that's what we do? Mm. And how can I demonstrate that level of sort of quality and consistency across 100,000 conversations? Mm. So that, and it's crucial that I do find a way of being able to convince you about that, because ultimately we in the voluntary sector need to be very clear about what our contribution is, because long term we will need people to pay for it. Right. And you wouldn't pay for anything where you weren't convinced of the sort of quality and the effectiveness.
Well, particularly when there are so many organisations calling for that support, I
Absolutely.
guess. So,
Absolutely.
You're in competition in some way, shape or form, even if it's not a traditional competitive environment, I suppose.
And I think, the other thing is then once you can start to do things like that, then you can start to have very different conversations about how you're funded. So, we would like to be able to fund our service based much more on essentially paying for those outcomes, rather than me saying, well, this is how much it costs to run my service, which we can raise money on that basis. But I would much rather, have a stronger value proposition whether that's with a business or, with the NHS or Department of Education or whatever else it is, to sort of say, this is the service I provide. What value does that bring to you? And let's negotiate about whether or not we can come up with a sort of a price or a contribution that we both agree on.
And as you look across society generally, do you see more willingness to engage and to support from people as a rule? Is there a trend towards that, or are people actually becoming harder to engage and connect in your activities?
So I think it's really interesting. I think we have seen such an interest in volunteering for us. So in the day that we launched the service publicly, we had 12,000 people sign up to volunteer on the day. Wow. So I think people are looking for ways to help. I think we need to make it easier, and we need to make it fit in with people's sort of everyday lives. But I think the interesting thing is, I think that 40%, just over 40% of our volunteers are under 25, which is also great.
That's amazing.
And I think increasingly young people coming out of education, whatever age they are, and going into the workplace, want to work somewhere where there are opportunities for them to do more than just earn money. And I think, increasingly we're seeing that shift with young people saying, I kind of want to know what else you're interested in here. So you're interested in me as an employee able to generate value for your business, but what else are you interested in? What are your values beyond that? So I think that is interesting.
One of the things I love about Shout is the simplicity of it. Simple name.
Yeah.
Although it's a sort of a voiceless shout, which in itself is an interesting creative tension. But it's a simple name, it's text-based, which is simple. I mean, it's not hard to understand or to appreciate the value that will come from it. And I think that's powerful from a communication sense. But where next for you? I mean, are you looking at other technologies? Do you see it growing and expanding into new areas?
Yes. So I think for us, what's amazing about the service, alongside the service itself, if you like, is the data which it generates. So most of our conversations are about an hour long, and we're at the moment doing sort of 500 plus conversations a day. So we are generating a huge bank of knowledge and information about young people's mental health, or people's mental health generally in the UK. So we want to use that data in lots of different ways. So we have a partnership with Imperial College, and that's about making sure that our data is made available to clinicians and academics that are interested in research and improving services using our data. So that's one bit. But we also think there's a whole range of new digital tools, products, services that we could develop based on need. So we will do our best to understand through our data where there are areas of need, and how best we can develop digital products and tools that might meet some of those needs. So that's the sort of longer term for us.
Well, that's really interesting. An hour long. So are you able to sort of track the pattern of a text-based conversation, so you can identify the sort of journey, if you like, that people will go on from that transition from a crisis moment to a moment of calm, and what identify triggers and moments, and do you go as far as to use algorithms, or? Yeah.
Yes. So it's a fairly formulaic 5-stage conversation. So so someone texts in, and you start by building rapport. So you start simply by saying, thanks so much for texting in. That's taken a lot of courage. Well done. And just building that sort of rapport, because when people are in that sort of crisis moment, the most important thing is that for them not to feel that they are being judged about that. So that's the first bit. And then the second bit is really exploring what's led them to feel this way. And probably that's where the most interesting bit of our data is. So, what's driving some of their behaviours. And at the sort of extreme end, you have things like self-harm and suicidal intent, and what's kind of driving people to that. But that's where you get probably the bulk of if you like, the unloading of what's happening. And again, just the listening in that is really important, and encouraging people to say things. And text is great for this. You don't actually have to articulate it. You can write it, and sometimes that's a lot easier. But about 40% of people tell us that they're telling us something that they've never told anyone before.
Wow.
So in that sort of exploring stage of the conversation, then we go on to to identify a goal and make a plan, and that's really how it works. But it's really in that exploring bit where we feel there is so much we have to offer to the clinical world, but also education, all sorts of other places where we can really understand what's driving some of this. I
can imagine you must almost be developing kind of lexicon here as well. I mean, even emojis. I guess people use emojis, right?
Yeah.
And that a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, maybe there's an opportunity to have almost a specific set that relate to moods or something. There,
Yeah.
it'd be a great thing for somebody to do, right? Is produce a set of emojis that would be a part of that process
Yeah.
that would enable people to communicate well. But I imagine it's really interesting because text-based communication is effectively a different language, and I mean, your volunteers have got to be pretty fluent in how to interpret a lot of different codes and signals, I
Yeah.
imagine, as well. In that,
Yes.
yeah, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. And anybody that wants to volunteer, what do they do? What action should they take?
They just go to www.giveusashout.org.
And anybody who is in a moment of crisis and wants to contact
Text
you?
us 85258.
Great. Victoria, it's brilliant work. I mean, it really is amazing. I think it's a fabulous initiative and so important. And I think certainly as we talk to brands and businesses and talk to them about how they can engage with the world, I think this is the sort of thing, in my view, that organisations really need to get behind and get people volunteering with, promote the service to people. So yeah, it's fantastic. And thanks so much for coming in and talking to us about it.
No, it's a pleasure. And, you know, Super Union has been part of the journey from the very earliest days of Heads Together, which is obviously where Shout came from, through to our launch sort of 6 weeks ago. So, very much part of our journey. So thank you.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks.